We finally have a list of accounts and a deployed instance of a contract, which means it's time to actually write some meaningful tests. Now that might just lead to a can of worms in its own. You might be wondering, well, what exactly are we testing here? Fortunately, we've got a rather small contract, which means it's going to be pretty straightforward for testing. I want you to look at this contract right here. And remember, this is essentially just a contract that stores some tiny little string. And I want you to imagine what behavior about this contract is kind of important for its functionality. I think that probably there's two big things that come to mind around this contract. First off, I want to be sure that if I ever initialize an instance of this contract, it sets up some default value for this message property right here. So I think that maybe we should have one test that just makes sure that whenever we create an instance of the contract, we get some default message assigned. The second big thing that I would want to test is to make sure that once we call setMessage with a new message to store, we should make sure or make some type of assertion to make sure that the message property gets updated as well. So I think that's the two big things I would want to assert, or the two big things I would want to test. I want to make sure that this contract gets a default message, and I want to make sure that I can change it in some fashion. So I think we should write tests around both those cases. And maybe we should write one other test as well. Maybe we should make sure that our before each logic right here is working properly. So maybe we should have one more test that just makes sure that we are able to successfully deploy a contract. To make sure that we are successfully deploying something, I think we can probably just make sure that our inbox object right here, and remember this represents our contract, we can probably just make sure that this thing gets an address assigned to it. The presence of an address means that this contract has likely been successfully deployed to the local Ganache test network right here. So inside of this first it statement, I'm going to leave the text it deploys a contract the same. But we're going to update the body of this function, and we're going to make an assertion to say that the inbox contract does get an address assigned. At this point, we've only looked at one type of assertion. We've only looked at the assert.equal assertion. But there's another function on the assert module that we can make use of here, and it is called assert.ok. So we're going to write assert.ok and then pass in inbox.options.address. All right, so let's talk about what this is doing here. First off is the address property on the options object. Remember that we just looked at the console log of inbox a moment ago, and we had said that it had an options object. One property on there was address. After we deploy the contract to the test network, this address property will contain the address of wherever this contract was deployed to. So just by looking up this property on this object, if an address exists here, well, okay, I feel pretty confident in saying that the contract was probably successfully deployed. Now on to the assert.ok method. First off, remember that the assert method or the assert module is a part of the Node standard library. The OK method right here makes an assertion that whatever we are passing into the function is a value that exists. So the OK method right here is essentially saying, is this a defined value? If inbox.options.address is null or undefined, then this test will fail. But if it is any truthy value, and a string, which is what the address is a truthy value, then the test will pass. So let's save this file and run our tests and see how we're doing. Back at the command line, we'll do npm run test again. We'll wait for a moment for the test or the contract to compile, And it does take a couple seconds every time. It's just that just long enough to feel a little bit awkward. And there we go. So it looks like we are successfully now passing that test. In general, I do always recommend starting off with a very simple test like this, just to make sure that your deployment process is working correctly. So for example, let's say maybe we had failed to actually send our transaction to the network. So notice that I just commented this line of code right here. So now we are only initializing our contract and telling Web3 that we want to initialize or start to configure its deployment. But we haven't actually sent a transaction to our test network to actually create the contract. So now, if we run npm run test with this, I would expect to see a failure. I would expect to see something that says, hey, property doesn't exist. And we should see that it has deployed successfully, has not been defined. All right, so yep, looks like we got cannot read property address of defined. So again, this is a nice quick test just to make sure that we have successfully deployed our contract. All right, now I'm going to uncomment the .send method, which means our test should be passing again. Now let's pause right now. When we come back in the next video, we're going to start to write a test to make sure that we are able to create our instance of the inbox contract with an initial message. So we'll take care of that in just a moment.